I'm Sam Thompson. I'm a program manager here at the US-UK Fulbright Commission, and I'd like to thank you all again for joining us for the next event in our Across the Pond public webinar series, initiating transatlantic conversations between Fulbright scholars. We're exploring a wide range of topics in the series, drawing on expertise of our US and UK scholars as part of our mission to advance knowledge, promote civic engagement, and to develop compassionate leaders. Education exchange between the peoples of the United States and the United Kingdom sits at the heart of what we do, and presenting virtually is proving to be an effective way of connecting our UK and US cohorts of scholars, and including you, our audience, in our mission. Tonight brings together two Fulbright scholars, one from our UK cohort and one from our US cohort, as we journey into the wild to discuss national parks. During the second half of the 19th century, the US federal government enacted the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act. This bill sought to conserve the natural environment during an era of rapid expansion and settlement. Numerous other parks were created during this time, notably Sequoia, Yosemite, and Mount Rainier. In the mid-20th century, the UK began to enact similar legislation to conserve regions of outstanding natural beauty. The first of the UK's national parks to be created was the Peak District in 1951, followed by Snowdonia, the Lake District, and Dartmoor later that year. Today, there are 63 protected areas in the United States and 14 national parks in the United Kingdom. They're primarily understood through the lenses of conservation of nature, education about the environment, and recreation to promote mental and physical health. In the United Kingdom, 4 out of 5 people live in urban areas, and the same is true in the United States. These are towns, cities, and we all know that feeling of wanting to escape to nature, taking the fresh air, the view, the serenity, and the feeling at one with the natural world and environment. Perhaps even a little apprehensive of being off the grid for a while with no decent mobile signal. So let's take a virtual trip into the world this evening as we hear from our two speakers about their experiences and reflections of national parks in the United Kingdom and the United States. Before I introduce our two scholars, a little bit of housekeeping about the event this evening. So you will have perhaps got a notification when you joined the webinar, but we are going to be recording this evening's session, and we record all of our webinars. So what that means is if there's anything you miss that you want to go back to, or anything that you found really interesting, you want to think about some more, you can find the recording later on our website and on YouTube. Similarly, if there's an event in the series so far that you've missed, you'll be able to go back and find a recording of that. And also means you'll be able to find our future events if you're not able to make the live recordings of them. We also invite you to engage with our discussion this evening. So what that means will be, we want you to ask questions. You can do that in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. So the Q&A box will make sure that we see it. And feel free to ask questions throughout. This isn't like a lecture where we're going to ask you to wait until the end for your questions. If something springs to mind that seems relevant to the conversation that's happening, or if you just don't want to lose that question when it comes to you, type it in the chat box and we'll get to it when it feels like it fits nicely within the flow of the conversation. And with that out of the way, I'd like to get an opportunity to introduce our guests tonight. I'm joined by Lance Davis, who is a literature professor who perhaps read too many books for romanticizing the vagabond wanderer. She and her husband enjoy roaming the country in the summer in their conversion van and hope to one day visit all of the US national parks. During her Fulbright at Queen's University in Belfast in Irish literature, she hopes to apply that wandering spirit to the beautiful green hills and rugged coastlines of Northern Ireland. And Rebecca Charlton is a psychologist studying what happens as we age. She's from a coastal town and loves being by the sea. Rebecca enjoys walking, especially in national parks, as long as there's views or something interesting to look at. She's hoping to visit some new US national parks while on her Fulbright visit to the George Washington University in Washington, DC in the autumn. It's lovely to have you both with me this evening. Rebecca, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you. How are you?
Not too bad. And Lanta, how are you?
Yeah, great, thanks.
Great. So thank you both, as I've already said, for being here this evening. I guess if you could kick us off tonight, perhaps talking about your experience and your history, I suppose, with national parks so far. So I suppose, Rebecca, if I throw to you first, and then we'll hear from Lanta when you're through.
Okay. So I think, like most people, the national parks I was experienced first were those nearest to where I grew up. So I'm from the northeast of England. So Northumberland is my nearest national park. And Northumberland's a really big park that kind of goes along the coast a lot, but then quite far inland. And it includes a lot of history as well as sort of natural beauty. So a lot of Roman history along Hadrian's Wall, the border between Scotland and England, as well as sort of later history when there were raids between Scotland and England. So lots of castles, lots of beautiful places to walk. It's very hilly but very coastal. And so that's sort of where the first parks I went to when I was growing up. And then I think as you sort of get older and you start traveling more independently, you begin to sort of go to different places. And I just began to realize that all of the national parks in the UK are so different. But that idea of this protected space that we can access and is really sort of valuable. And I really like that idea that they're there for everyone and that they should be accessible and people should be able to visit them. And then over a number of years, I've been to the US and gone to their national parks, which are similar but completely different, and the scale is so much bigger than they are in the UK, of course. So that's kind of where my interest lies. It's very much as a layperson visiting national parks, not an expert in any way.
Yeah, I'm gonna reinforce, Rebecca. We're both coming at this, I think, as amateur delighters in national parks rather than experts. So my story is rather similar. I grew up in actually rural South Dakota, and we're about a 4-hour drive from the Badlands National Park and from Mount Rushmore. So I grew up with our family trips. We would go out west, and that would be kind of one of our first things we could do. And I just remember marveling that soil could be pink in the Badlands. Like, it was just one of my first kind of awakening experiences, because I grew up surrounded by cornfields and soybean fields, so I didn't really know that those kinds of spaces were like that. And so it was such a surprise to see, you know, anything bigger than flat or a gentle hill, and to all of a sudden see these high peaks. But beyond that, my husband and I have really started enjoying round trips, and like many, COVID helped that along, where it was one of the things that we could do. And so we had planned a different trip, but ended up adjusting things and went and spent one of our first just longer term experiences in both Glacier National Park and Yellowstone, where we actually had our 20-year-old giant ugly blue van that you can just kind of throw a mattress in and then be able to turn it into a camper. And so we did that for a full about 3 weeks in Glacier National Park and Yellowstone. And I got to enjoy parks on a whole different scale at that point. And I almost ran over a bear with the van. So it's seen some experiences along with me. And yeah, we've just really gotten to enjoy through different road trips, going to, we've done some in Arizona, but definitely hit a lot more in the West than the East. And I think that's probably actually one of the more well-known parts of our national parks, is when you think of the ones in the West, they're oftentimes the ones that are really grand in scale with the mountains and the vast expanses. And I also just think it's so neat that while I know that they have been touched and that they've been cultivated, that we have some truly wild spaces, like some untouched land that actually, it seems like, has been around for, you know, a really, really long time compared to the constant cultivation and development in other spaces. So that's been a little bit of my own personal experience with them.
And actually, that's really interesting difference between the UK and the US, because in the UK, a lot of our national parks are farmed. So you have these, in the US, I get the impression that it is these completely protected areas that are managed, but are wild in a lot of ways. Whereas in the UK, a lot of national park spaces are, you know, privately owned. So you have lots of farms, you know, the Lake District and the Peak District. Large chunks of those are farmland or private land. And so that's a really big difference between them, actually.
Yeah. So are your parks, I remember kind of like walking through some gates. Is that because oftentimes they're also grazing lands, like kinds of farms, or are they farms of crops?
It depends on where you are, but so in the Lake District, hill farming, so lots of sort of grazing sheep is really common. And some of the national parks probably also abut sort of private land where there would have been some of the grounds of the large houses that were in those areas. So some of that is still considered private land, so owned by landowners, but people have the right to access it, which is kind of a strange sort of way to think about it compared to US national parks where they're owned by the government and nobody owns them apart from that.
Yeah, I think one of the really unique things that we have is with that wildness element, like you feel like you're in this kind of controlled space, because there's roads and there's, you know, people there. But like almost every week I read about somebody, you know, getting attacked by a bear, or like there was a guy who followed a wolf into its cave to like try to take a picture of it. And it's just a really important, I think, reminder that there is this really actually dangerous wild element to a lot of our national parks that you can easily forget about and get kind of lulled into safety, when you really, like, I learned I really did need to bring bear spray along. Like people have been killed by grizzly bears, and we've kind of forgotten that. Like we're so used to seeing, I think, pictures of things, or think we're in this really safe space, which in some ways you are, but also you can't get, you know, 5 feet away from a grizzly bear and expect it to be happy with like a camera in its face.
I think we don't have that level of peril in UK national parks, really. We have bears, not so much.
I was going to ask when Lance was saying that she almost hit a bear with her van. Is that something you've managed to do in the South Downs, or is that...
No. Large butterflies are about as close as I've gone to wildlife. Maybe actually I did see a badger, which was quite exciting. That's
basically the same thing.
They're just like small bears, sure. No, yeah. But when I was in the US, I've been in national parks sort of in Utah, and you sort of go somewhere and you park and there are all these signs saying, you know, be careful of bears, don't leave food in the car. And if you're traveling between places and you're sort of, you know, you may be sort of hiring an apartment in different places and you've got food, you kind of think, oh no, I remember being terrified. It's like, what do I do? Do I carry it with me? Am I supposed to just, you know, put it outside the car and hope it's there when I come back?
Yeah, when we camped, they have bear lockers for storage, because that was one of the things that they frequently do is come and attack picnic sites. And once they eat human food, then they're gonna like come after humans later. So it's really interesting how I think that challenge of being able to invite people to appreciate the space while also trying to protect the wild and the space that it's there to protect is a really difficult thing. So even something like bears, like I feel really bad because they're just in their natural environment doing what they're trained to do, but people, you know, try to get too close or don't realize what they're doing. And there's definitely a dangerous element to our parks, I think, that the UK has maybe some bits of, but maybe a little bit different. Like it's really bizarre. I've actually seen I saw a person in a body bag at Yosemite who fell trying to climb up like a waterfall. And yeah, you can encounter that here. You have to really remember that you need to be cautious in the space that you're in.
Yeah, and I think that here with I mean, over COVID, especially with people accessing national parks, and I think sometimes going out at times where maybe they wouldn't normally, like when the weather was really bad, or maybe people who are just less familiar with how quickly the weather can change in certain areas. There were a number of cases where you know, the rescue services had to go and pick people up because, you know, they'd gone climbing on when it was snowing or something, and then got stuck and injured. So yeah, that sort of personal injury and risk about sort of walking and, you know, waterfalls or climbing and is the same. I was interested when you were talking about bears, actually, I was thinking about wolves, because there's sort of move to reintroduce wolves in the UK, especially sort of up in the Cairngorms in Scotland. And I was just wondering if, you know, I know that I think around some of your national parks, they've reintroduced wolves, and then there's been problems in the local area.
Yeah, so Yellowstone just reintroduced wolves not terribly long ago, and they're a really interesting example. So they had kind of cycled them out because they had been attacking ranchers. Well, at least they were being blamed for attacking the animals in the area, some of the cattle and things around the Wyoming area. So they had mostly been completely eliminated from Yellowstone, and they slowly reintroduced them. It was really interesting because they found that it helped the biodiversity so much of Yellowstone again, because the elk without having an immediate predator had just kind of taken over. They were starting to eat too much of the bark. They were actually changing the way the river would flow because of the damage they were doing to the trees. And just a simple act of like reintroducing wolves to that native area helped kind of push things back towards where it was. It helped contain the elk population. The river went back to the way that it was. Biodiversity got better. So yeah, I think those kinds of things are really interesting. And again, kind of raise that question of the balance of safety and wildness, and how do you protect a space and protect people. And yeah, I didn't know that wolves were being reintroduced in the UK, which like specific areas where they were native, I assume, or
yeah. So I mean, well, we used to have wolves. They were eradicated a
In
long
the Middle
time
Ages, I
ago.
think.
So I think they're bringing European wolves over, and the idea is that they'll be released in, I think, in Scotland in the Cairngorms, which is one of the big national parks there. But again, I mean, I think the same as in the US, there's this balance between sort of, people who live there and farmers who are around there with, people wanting to sort of rewild, and the importance of that sort of balance within the ecology, that, you do get, things do change when you remove predators from the environment. And that sort of balance is quite difficult. I don't think there's an easy solution to those conversations.
yeah. The UK has such different like questions with that too, I think, because it's been so populated for so much longer than the States have been. So even trying to figure out how far you would go back to try to recover or reclaim. Like Yellowstone wasn't that long ago that they had lost the wolves. They knew how to reintroduce and what that would look like. But man, if you guys haven't had wolves since like the Middle Ages, that's really, that's a space.
Yeah, I think it's a couple of hundred years, but I'm not sure. I want to say more than 100 years, 150 maybe.
Okay.
We also have issues of in some areas, some of the wildlife that used to be more prolific over here that gets reintroduced, but it'll be introduced in like an animal park. And then so wild boar, for instance, which are much more populous on the continent, but were again eradicated in the UK. We started bringing them back into animal parks, and because they're somewhat burrowing and tenacious creatures, they get out of their enclosures, and now in the southeast at least, you can find wild boar again because they've essentially repopulated of their own accord by escaping animal parks and then being hard to track down once they get out. And that's some of the other issues that we deal with, I guess, in the rewilding of our spaces, is that sometimes it just happens of its own accord.
Yeah, I think the other animal that people are reintroducing in the UK more widely are beavers. So we haven't had beavers in the UK for a long time, and again, as you were saying, that it's, their loss has changed the environment and changed the way rivers flow, but also have had an impact on flooding. So there'll be more floods, and where people have begun to reintroduce beavers, then actually it's sort of helped resolve some of those problems that have begun to occur. So that's happening like across different parts of the UK now.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things I really appreciate about the national parks, is that I would never have known about the wolves and how ecology is so connected to these different species. And we went to the Everglades too this past summer and learned about the accidental introduction of the python there, and that's completely destroying the diversity of the Everglades. It's just eating all of the life that's there. They're eating rabbits and like they can eat crocodiles. It's crazy. And so being able to even just kind of learn about some of these conservation efforts, I think, is really incredible and a very valuable part of national parks that someone like me as a literature person just wouldn't probably know about or should know, but doesn't come across it all that often without these kinds of visits to help open my eyes.
So we've got a couple of questions. I think this one's just quite a nice one to start off with. So in your time in your host countries on your Fulbright, so are there any target national parks that you've got on your list that you want to get out to in COVID permitting? But is there a list that you've got that you want to be able to make sure that you get to by the time you finish your grant?
Well, I'm going to be in the northeast east in Washington, D.C. So I'm hoping to get into Virginia a little bit more. So I haven't really been to a lot of national parks around there. So I know there's Shenandoah and the Great Smoky Mountains, and maybe going as far down into Georgia a little bit. So I'm hoping that I'll visit some of those on the East Coast. So as Lanta said, I've been to quite a few national parks on the West Coast, but I've also been up to Acadia in Maine, which is beautiful, and maybe I'll get to go back there again. But I think we'll have to wait and see how much we can travel when I'm over there. What about you, Lanta?
Yeah, well, I'm still hoping to learn about a few more from you that I can write down and put on my to-do list. We just went to Giant's Causeway yesterday, actually, which was incredible. And I know it's not, I don't believe it's officially a national park. It's under the National Trust. But that was really beautiful to see. And the formations were like nothing I've ever encountered before. So I have that. And as a lit person, I'm gonna have to make my way up to the Lake District at some point in time. I feel like that's kind of a prerequisite of the field. So that's definitely on my list. But otherwise, yeah, I'm just trying to figure out, I really love walking. I would love to go on some of the longer walks in the area. So I'm definitely up for suggestions too, for those of you guys who have insights on where I should go while I'm here.
There are quite a lot of long sort of straight walks in the UK. So either like the Pennine Way, which literally goes all the way up the Pennines, or there are various ones named after. So in the northeast where I'm from, there's the St Oswald's Way and there's the St Cuthbert's Way, and they're all sort of walks that end at sort of various places. So often they end in Lindisfarne, which is a National Trust property, which is in Northumberland National Park. Which is where there used to be a monastery and a castle on this island that's cut off by a causeway at high tide. But it's to do with sort of all the religious history of the area. So you kind of walk through all these really beautiful places. But some of those like long sort of trails and walks are really amazing. And a lot of them are in parts of national parks, but not wholly, in just other parts of the country, which are really beautiful. So some of those are great. And there are some really great guidebooks that sort of will just take you along them, or you can sort of say, well, actually, how far do you want to walk today, rather than sort of having to do sort of 20 miles every day for like 3 weeks.
Yeah, I really admire that the policy of having the land open for people to walk through. I think that's one of the more unique things about the UK, that you can just kind of go on these longer walks or tours. Other random fact of the summer, I was even just briefly parked in someone's house while it was raining, and I was trying to wait it out, and we got shot at, like a shotgun came off trying to like chase us off the land. So there's these weird moments in the US where people are very protective about like you being on their space. And so I really like the UK kind of mentality of a little bit more welcoming and having public lands, or not public, sorry, but lands open for everyone to be able to access and walk through.
It's only through a big protest that we were able to do that in the UK. Before, private land was a huge deal in the UK.
They had sort of mass protests and mass trespasses, and for a long time, for like probably I think nearly 100 years before actually that the right to roam was made into law. So it's relatively recent, although it's been sort of talked about for a really long time. So, I mean, there's the Ramblers Association, I think, which I think had these massive sort of protests where they got thousands of people to go and like walk through various landowners' estates in order to sort of force the issue. But yeah, it sounds amazing. I think it's just makes us forget how long it took people to actually get that through and to make that happen into something that we can value and that we're allowed to do now.
I think that brings us quite nicely to another question actually from our audience, which is on access to nature. So you talked about perhaps a more welcoming element to the way that the UK does things with its national parks, and we've got a question here on the US has a lot more wild nature, and I guess you spoke about that with the fact that you might come across a bear in a US national park, but it feels a lot less accessible perhaps to some, and especially for those in cities than maybe it does in the UK. Is that something you think is a familiar feeling in the US, or do you think there's ways of addressing that even?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Since we don't have a lot of public transit linking places together, it really does require a car typically to get to the national parks and even to navigate them once you're there. That's something that actually surprised me as I have adventured into them, is how often you need a car to be able to like get very far. Even if we were just to camp, we could only see maybe 1% of the park. They're very much scheduled to run on these big loops. So it really does rely on you having access, having a car, especially if you're trying to go to the west. They're very small towns, small areas that they typically are part of. And I know there's all sorts of different parks. Some of them are in very populated areas. But when you're talking about like the big expansive ones in the west, like Yellowstone is in Wyoming, and just even airport access or things like that can be a little trickier than what you would think. So we do rely, I mean, the United States in general relies on transportation, on vehicles. And I do wish that there were better ways of being able to get people to them. But yeah, as of now, I don't know off the top of my head how we're trying to solve access issues, or if we do have any like methods or strategies for that. Because I do love how that was one of the things that when I first traveled anywhere, I was so amazed at how much public transit there was, because everything that we have relies on vehicles. So just being able to get somewhere without that, I think is really powerful and nice. And I do wish we could figure out access a lot better. But it still is one of the places, I think, one of the only places in the US that I've been where I've seen people from so many different walks of life gathered together and enjoying the same thing. Like we're growing increasingly more partisan, it seems like, more polarized. But national parks have been always, for me, such a space where so many different kinds of people are, both people who love to walk and hate to walk, people I would normally think hate nature, but actually really love the national park. It's a really interesting space. So there's quite a mix, even though I do, yeah, there's definitely some problems in terms of actually accessing them well. We even wouldn't have been able to do it without this giant blue van that we inherited accidentally. It was a kind of lucky crapshoot that helped open them up a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the UK, I mean, obviously the space differences are much smaller, but I think that it's possible to access pretty much all national parks by public transport, but a lot of them are going to be difficult. And, there are going to be a few buses, or there's going to be a bus every 2 hours or something. So it's not always super easy. I think the Peak District is one of the best ones for getting into on the train, because you can literally get the train to the middle of the Peak District and then walk between train stations if you want to, which is amazing.
And the line connects Sheffield and Manchester. It's such a, yeah, it's very well connected for an area that is quite, I suppose, sparsely populated in comparison.
So, but I think that, I mean, a lot of the time it's going to be a bus. You're going to have to get to a major city and then get a bus out to get to a national park. And I suppose the other different one is the South Downs, where you have sort of quite big cities on either end of it. And you could technically walk the whole South Downs way between these two sort of major cities. But yeah, I think that access is still an issue. It's probably not as restricted as it is in the US, just because of the distances aren't as big. But I think that there are still sort of difficulties with people getting to them.
Yeah. There's a question that's a little bit longer, so bear with me as I talk through it. But I think it touches on some interesting points. So it's calling back to when we were talking about rewilding, and talking about the idea of romanticization versus reality in our national parks and our wild spaces. So the person writing grew up in the Peak District, and over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, the farmers in her village have seen a huge increase of crime, littering, trespassing into unsafe areas, or bothering the farm animals, and even verbal abuse of the farmers to the point of violence, physical violence, and threat on farmers. And it seems to come from a frustration with discovering that this wild area, as it's seen as a tourist destination for urban visitors, is actually a site of life and work for many rural people. Do you have any thoughts on how we can keep the national parks wild and publicly accessible, whilst also protecting local communities and their ways of life? And is there a similar urban-rural divide that you'd find in parks in the US as well?
I mean, I wonder if this is a more uniquely UK issue, because there are people who sort of are working and living within national parks, which I get the impression is quite different from the UK to the US. But I mean, I think it's a real problem. I think we've all, anybody who's been to a national park in the last year and a half has seen some of this, whether it's littering or, people having dogs off their lead in areas where birds are nesting on the ground, this idea of it being sort of wild and protected, but then you have to restrict your own behavior in a way in order to sort of be a responsible citizen of this environment. And I don't know if partly it's, education and sort of having people understand more about why these things are or aren't, or if it's just something that we're always going to have to deal with, that some people won't sort of behave in a way that is going to balance those needs. I think it's tricky, but I don't know if you have similar or different issues in the US. Man,
I feel like some of these things are definitely so outside of my basic knowledge of the national parks too. But I mean, I think this just hits at, there's so many tensions with national parks in that, I mean, on the one hand, you have this conservation, preservation, and keeping it a particular way, with also wanting people to experience it. And because people are experiencing it, it's going to be polluted. And at the same time, so similar to what I was talking about with Yellowstone too, is that Yellowstone was having kind of some struggles, especially with the local ranchers, in terms of keeping, like, how do you keep this space contained, but also what it is. And so when you're reintroducing something like the wolves, that would raise challenges with the cattle farmers, the ranchers in the area, and even just the way that I think national park towns work as well, is that it oftentimes brings a lot of tourism to sometimes some very rural places that don't have all of the resources and might find it challenging or otherwise frustrating. It can bring some economic revival to some of the parts, but I know that it can also bring a lot of problems, a lot of pollution, a lot of issues along the way. And so there's always, I think, that tension with parks, and that you always, and I really think most of life, I don't mean to be corny and philosophical, but oftentimes with every kind of good, there comes a sort of negative with it. And I think that's definitely true with any kind of park or people trying to appreciate anything. Like it's great that we're trying to appreciate it, but we oftentimes bring some negative consequences along with it. So I have no profound answers for how to balance or manage that, but just definitely acknowledging that is an issue. And frankly, I don't have any smarts about how to fix it off the top of my head either.
Do you think there's a similar, at least in terms of how it's experienced by both visitors and people living in those areas, a similar sort of urban-rural divide? I was thinking particularly of the story that you told earlier about the time where someone fired a warning shot with a shotgun while you're waiting. Like, is that perhaps indicative of maybe a protectiveness around a way of life, or even if that way of life is wanting to escape, the hustle bustle of urban life and being off the grid, and then not wanting people sort of bringing their urban sort of problems and tourism with them? Do you think that's sort of an expression of a similar tension?
Yeah, I so growing up in South Dakota, I grew up in the rural area. I'm very familiar with the people who live in rural spaces. And I understand and have even heard many of my loved ones, for instance, say things like, oh, like, don't let XYZ know about this place, or do this, or there's very much a protection kind of thing, and this keeping things away from people that they see as threats. And so there's definitely an urban rural divide. And national parks, I'm sure, are a place where that comes into conflict. In some of these, rural areas like Wyoming and some of the areas in the West, obviously there are some that are closer to cities where that line is going to be much more blurred and not going to be as restrictive. But yeah, in terms of both this kind of protection of space, I think definitely there's this, I think there's a really great tension with especially the rural people that I grew up with of loving the land, of a real connection to it, and they feel oftentimes like urban people come in and tell them how they're supposed to do something with the land, or like come in and try to do something different with it. And so it becomes very protective, and it becomes a very kind of putting fences up in all sorts of ways of trying to establish those boundaries that they see as a protection of what they love. And what they know, what somebody's trying to kind of come in and tell them what to do with. So national parks just kind of bring that up on a, I think, bigger scale in terms of their own kind of private appreciation of the land. And then what they see is this, I don't know, this use of it that they maybe just don't understand, appreciate, or that takes a bunch of people and all of a sudden changes this thing that they love.
That sounds a bit like what somebody else had said earlier about the romanticization of the countryside as this sort of bucolic, beautiful place, where actually, you know, the reality is that people work there and they have working farms and they have, you know, lives to live, and that people kind of coming in and then trying to sort of impose this romanticized idea on the reality of somebody's working existence and everyday life is, you know, you can understand why that's frustrating and annoying.
I think that idea of romanticization as well leads into an interesting difference, perhaps, in the role that national parks play within sort of the national character and our experiences of the wild spaces in our home countries. You were talking earlier, Rebecca, about sort of walks named after saints' names, and that's certainly something that I think about when I think about our national parks, as ideas of pilgrimages as like a big part of why people walked in the United Kingdom, at least going back into our own history, and then sort of that contrast with the industrialization of the 19th century. Do you have reflections on the way that your home country's national character is impacted by national parks, or that relationship that you feel between your national parks and how they might differ from the host country's sort of relationship with nature?
I think it's almost, I wonder if it's not so much the fact that there are big differences between the UK and the US, but that there are differences between people from more urban and more rural environments in terms of how they interact with nature and wildlife and other things. So, I mean, I grew up actually living abroad a lot of my childhood, but when I was home, I was in South Shields, which is right on the River Tyne, part of the big conurbation around Newcastle and Sunderland. So I'm very much from a sort of urban area, whereas I think that my attitude to wildlife is completely different to somebody who grew up there or who grew up working the land. So I think that those kind of attitudes are quite different, but there may be similarities between the UK and the US in terms of that.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I was clear on your question too. Were you looking at kind of philosophical differences, or sorry?
Yeah, I suppose I'm just curious as to, I think at least on a very sort of basic level, from the perspective of someone who's not really been to any of the grand US national parks, I think of the UK's relationship with nature as very pastoral, whereas I think of the US as having these romantic and epic vistas. And I guess, do you think that there's a different relationship and character to that relationship between national culture and nature?
We have epic vistas, they're just a bit smaller.
That's great. Man, you're asking some profound questions. I wrote down here, like, go to Yellowstone. I mean, yes, and this is in part just drawing upon my literary background, but just the romanticization of the West, period, in the Western, in what it meant in terms of its association with freedom, and of course, what Americans kind of think about this idea of freedom. All of those can be wrapped up into some of the ways, anyway, that we see our national parks. And I think that would be a different kind of view of what nature can look like, and very much, I mean, there's also, oh man, sorry, it's such a big question that I'm just kind of thinking about. On the one hand, we have this great respect for this bigness of nature. And on the other hand, we've had places like Las Vegas that are trying to like subdue nature in every possible way in these harsh conditions and turn it into this thing that it really isn't or shouldn't be. So we have, I think, a really mixed, weird relationship in some ways, of really respecting this wildness and admiring it or romanticizing it and kind of associating it with a kind of freedom. And on the other hand, we do have this kind of mentality of trying to, restrain and I guess rule over it on the other hand. So I definitely think there's some different views of that. But in terms of even just the writers that I'm thinking about for how people have written about national parks in both places, the poetry of Whitman is very different from like the text of John Muir, writing about the spaces. There's differences in terms of how they're looking at it, how they're interacting with it, what they're focusing on. So there's definitely parts of that in there, but it's hard for me to just kind of pick, I guess, one or two ways in which they might be different, similar.
I think you touched on a really interesting point, which is that there's almost something paradoxical about the idea of a national park, and that you're saying this area is wild and beautiful, but here's where it ends, and that's a really odd boundary setting in terms of we're wishing to preserve the wilderness, but also a specific bit of
Only
yes, put a fence around it and a road through it.
Yeah, even the artificialness of national park towns, I think, are really interesting. So you get to like places, the Great Smokies, Gatlinburg was really a fascinating national park town. So you have this kind of big forest town, but then you have weird wood buildings that kind of look like a hokey hoedown kind of town. And that's common in a lot of national park towns, where they'll have one town that's kind of sprung up to have hotels and feed people. And it ends up usually looking kind of fake, hokey West. Not always, obviously, but a lot of them kind of have that look. And it's like it's trying to feed into this sort of experience. And it is interesting because you have this kind of artificialness outside of it, to go experience the nature inside of it. It's a weird paradoxical feeling.
I think that's sort of slightly different to the UK, where what you often find are these, lovely old villages and towns where there's a lot of history and the buildings are really beautiful, but then they can be slightly swamped by visitors. So, I slightly understand that idea of going, well, we live over here, but you tourists go over here to this fake village we made for you, like a sort of film set version of where we are, so that we can continue with our normal lives without you all getting in the way all the time.
You certainly have the idea of this is the pub where the locals go and this is the pub where the walkers go in some villages, right? Which is I guess a similar thing, but not quite nearly on the same scale.
In the US, a lot of the national parks close in the wintertime too, don't they? So I wonder if that's part of it. Almost you can just go, well, we don't need that part of town right now, and you can just sort of almost fence it off and leave it until next spring when visitors are going to come back and you need that extra space. I suppose it may feel more useful to do that in those places where visitors are definitely not coming for certain parts of the year. Whereas I think in the UK, the weather is usually such all year round that national parks aren't really ever closed, although certain parks will close or will say you shouldn't go because of the weather or dangerous conditions, but completely different in the US.
Yeah, so even we went to Glacier National Park and we're there late May, and they were still in the process of trying to get all the snow out so that you could actually go through the route. So yeah, some of them are just completely unable to be explored in the same way. So the towns they literally do shut down for part of the year.
That's really interesting. It talks to the tourism almost more than the conservationism in a way. That's really fascinating. You mentioned that you'd had on your notes visit Yellowstone, and I wondered if sort of we veer back to that way. Not only are there these highlights and things that I suppose almost dominate the pop culture conversation around national parks, but beyond the big ones, there are also any recommendations you have of not just these must-sees, the headline acts, if you will, but are there any hidden gems that you think people should check out as well?
Yes. I actually, this is maybe cheating, but I actually think that there's lots of really great state parks that are worth in really exploring. That was something that surprised me. So in South Dakota, for instance, Badlands and Mount Rushmore are the national parks, but Custer State Park is incredible, like one of my favorite places I've ever visited. And when I was living in Oregon too, there's all sorts of great places you can go around, but there's also a state park where you can walk behind 10 waterfalls, and it's one of the most spectacular places that I've ever been. So even just exploring some of these smaller parks and not only looking for the ones with that tag of national is really, I think, important. And you can find so many gems that are much closer than trying to, get in your car and drive for 15 hours to make it to specifically the national park. So yeah, just going to whichever ones are closest, I think, is also helpful. And checking out state parks, because they really have done a good job of also preserving some really beautiful parks for, to make it easier for people actually, not exactly local, but at least closer by, to be able to enjoy as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I agree. That idea of that, the national parks are amazing, and obviously, it's what we're talking about, but there are other places too. It doesn't have to be a national park for it to be beautiful and a great place to walk. I mean, I'm quite sort of, I like the views. I'm not just a hiker. Like, if there's not something nice to look at, I'm really a bit bored. So I'm very sort of low attention span when it comes to hikes. So yeah, I like a view, and I think that some of the walking books are great for that, where they'll just sort of take you on a really beautiful walk that will kind of go through part of the national park, but it's not sort of completely rigidly stuck to that, so that you can do sort of circular walks, or you can do a sort of long walk from one place to another, and really just have a great time and see lots of wonderful things. Where there's tons of butterflies out through the summer in the UK, and you can just walk through areas of woods or meadows where you can just see so much nature is just there for you to see without any effort at all.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have picked up too is that there's some places you can go and maybe experience okay in a day, but if you are going to make a trip to one, I highly recommend too, you can camp usually for, I don't know, $15 a night at a lot of the national parks and state parks, but being able to actually stay for a while and kind of let it sink in and actually explore, as opposed to just getting on the loop with everybody else, and then you're just breathing in a lot of fumes as opposed to actually enjoying what you're there to see. So being able to slow down and actually see it well, if you are going to make a trek wherever that is, I think that's also a really important way to do parks, and just doing them for what they're intended for. So disconnecting, like some of the parks that I've been to, there is no Wi-Fi, so you just have no options. And it's actually really nice to be forced away from all of these busy things. But to actually be there and use it as a time to pay attention and disconnect and reconnect accordingly with the natural world, I think is really important. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do when we go there. But I still see so many tourists and with not actually experiencing the moment, but just recording it as they're encountering it. So making sure that you're actually seeing it seems like an obvious tip, but doesn't always seem to play out.
And I think actually, but sort of building on what you were saying, I think getting away from that sort of main car park or the main place you sort of go, like whether it's a tourist information center or a car park, if you walk half a mile away from that, you'll probably be on your own. But I think that idea that people drive somewhere or go to a main place, stop, look at the view, do a little sort of 20-minute walk and then get back in their car and go somewhere else, it doesn't take long for you to get away from everyone else. And then I think it feels like you do have whole spaces to yourself.
And I think so one of our other questions as well is do you prefer to have that sense of guided tour, whether that is with a guide or a guidebook, maybe using an online resource, or just to get lost in these spaces and to find your own experiences there?
I think it probably depends on how comfortable you are with that risk of not knowing where you are. If you're going somewhere and you just want to wander, then that's fine. I think you do have to be aware a little bit about where footpaths are and where you are and are not allowed to go. So a map and a compass are required, but then I think that's fine. It's always fun to do that, to just sort of, or to plan your own walk. It doesn't have to be something that somebody's suggesting. If you can read a map and that you're going to be on a ridge somewhere and you're going to get great views over the landscape, then I think there's a real value in that. But I certainly found in US national parks that the rangers were fantastic at giving you ideas for where to go, also for walks, and not necessarily things that were the standard walks or things that everybody was doing, but they were so knowledgeable about the parks, and I think that's a big difference to the UK, where it's not, you don't have that sort of like center place often, where you have people who are really experienced with the wildlife and the nature. And I think that is really useful about US national parks, where you've got experts on the ground who can say, well, actually at the moment you might see, an eagle if you go over there. Sort of that those kind of tips which are really valuable.
Yeah, I usually like to do a blend of both, where we oftentimes do a little bit of research before going, just to get a feel for what we really want to see and do. We'll talk to a ranger or someone to give us a few suggestions. But then we also like to just have unstructured time. So if we want to go down a path, we'll go down that path. But yeah, as you say, you want to make sure that you know your risk level too. You want to make sure you have a way out, things like that. But being able to have a little bit of space for both, where you do have a little bit of planned activities or things that you want to see, but do give yourself that ability to freely wander and walk. And I think that's a really big part of it as well, to go off, especially the normal routes, and be, I don't know, experiencing as much solitude in these spaces as you can too, is really rejuvenating. And I think one of the reasons you're there. So I definitely think that mixture is really helpful.
I'm really glad you both brought up the park ranger system in the US, because when the first time I went to the US, there's a small state park in Providence, Rhode Island, which I think is the smallest state park in the entire US. And it's so small, they only ever have one ranger on duty at any one time. And so everyone just calls him the Lone Ranger. And it was, we just thought that was delightful when we were there. But again, they're so knowledgeable and so enthusiastic, and you felt like you just talk all day and learn so much about the area, the ecology, the history of the space. And I think that's such a useful resource to have these people who are both incredibly well trained, but also who just love the space they're in and convey that enthusiasm to the visitors too.
And I think while we may not always have the same thing in the UK, most people who are in those spaces are going to be happy to talk to you and give you their top tips, especially if they're local to the area. So although there may be a bit of a not there because that's my favorite space and I don't want all of you tourists visiting, but I think that the idea of sort of sharing that sort of love of somewhere, I think it's quite common.
And so if we're talking about tips, I guess as we come up to the hour mark, are there any tips that you have for any potential would-be national park goers, either in the US or the UK? And perhaps some may be more applicable than others. Avoid bears, not going to do much good over here, but in Yellowstone that might be life-saving. So any tips that you might want to share with our audience at home?
I think for UK parks, if you're not going to drive in, then you probably have to think about public transport and how to access it and where the buses are and how often they go, because they are not going to be super frequent in many places, especially not in the summertime. But you can access the national parks that way. And I think that you probably need a decent map, especially if you want to just go for a walk and not necessarily know where you're going. Then, being able to get yourself out of a situation and not having to call mountain rescue to go and get you is probably a really good idea.
Yeah, well, I have one kind of corny thing and then probably some practical things, but I would actually suggest, if you want to experience and enjoy any kind of parks, I really like reading poetry. Reading poetry helped me kind of hone my attention to particular things. And so even just reading certain writers in different areas, like I never understood or appreciated my home state of South Dakota until I read Willa Cather. And she helped me kind of realize the uniqueness of the land and the space. And so being able to maybe read particular people who might be writing about the spaces that you are visiting has really helped me appreciate a lot of them. So that's my kind of corny literature tip. But more practically, just really paying attention. They usually, in most of the national parks that you'll visit, give you a little like paper handout, and on that are lots of warnings about what not to do. Like really pay attention to that what not to do thing. Because as much as I have been cautious, for instance, I have still had like an encounter with a bison where all of a sudden it like came around the fence and I thought that I was safe and protected from it, but it was a few feet away from me. And then I had to use a car to like block me so I could get back to where I was supposed to go. So just knowing what's out there, knowing what a safe distance is, heeding those kinds of things, being prepared in terms of clothing. Like we went to the Grand Canyon and just thought like, oh, Arizona's warm. We won't need, more than a long sleeve. And we almost froze to death in the Grand Canyon. So just really doing your research about the space that you're going to be into so that you do remember and realize that you need to protect yourself. You need to kind of be aware and not just hope that somebody's going to save you last second or I think those kinds of things are really important for exploring some of the parks that don't have quite as much of a constant monitoring or presence. Yeah.
And I think what you were saying about poetry is a really good idea. That sort of whatever it is for you, that like sort of be in the space in that moment and not sort of distracted by, looking at your mobile phone or sort of doing something else. If you're going to go, then go and enjoy it. And there is so much to see, and there is so much nature, whether it's plant life or animal life around us, that if you just take a minute and stop, then all of a sudden you see so much more.
I think then perhaps a nice note for us perhaps to end on might be, is there anything that you recommend that people read, watch, listen to ahead of a trip from the UK to the US or vice versa, to get a sense of what to expect, but also maybe to help them engage a little bit more?
I think both national park services in the UK and the US have really good websites now, actually, where you can sort of, if you're going to a certain area, you can say, well, what parks are in that area? And that's really useful as a starting point, just to kind of get some idea of the space you're going to be in and where you are and what's accessible and what isn't, and then sort of building your trip around that. I think those resources are actually great. And I think the UK one certainly has sort of parts about the history of the area as well as sort of the natural environment, so that you can, depending on what you're interested in, you can combine sort of history and culture with the natural world.
Yeah, I really love, she's not explicitly a national park writer, but Mary Oliver is one of my favorite poets who writes so beautifully and profoundly, I think, about nature and about attention. So I highly recommend her just in general. John Muir is the famous national park writer. He is spectacular to read, to get a feel for some of those things. And then just more practically, honestly, I think the National Geographic magazine does pretty great introductions to a lot of the national parks in the US. And so they cover it from a lot of different ranges. So it's less, I suppose, specifically cultural and just more practical. But I really appreciate what they do sometimes in terms of giving you an introduction into conservation efforts, into the different, histories of the parks too. So that can be really helpful. And I'm sure there are podcasts and other things out there that I am just not aware of, but I watched most of the National Geographic's one before. Like that was one of my COVID things that I did, was kind of hype myself up for going by looking at those. And I did find them quite helpful.
Great. And I suppose on the note of podcasts, one of our audience members has highlighted an episode of the 99% Invisible podcast, where there's an episode on Right to Roam and the Ramblers Association. So if anyone at home wanted more information on that little bit that we talked about earlier, then 99% Invisible has you covered. Rebecca, Lanta, thank you so much for joining us today. That was really fascinating, and I really enjoyed just hearing what it was that made you both interested in and enjoy these spaces. So thank you both for joining us today. We've got a few more events scheduled for the next couple of weeks. So if you are interested in more of what our scholars have to bring you, we have next week on the 10th of August, photographic memory, which is about how we interact with spaces of the past. Then we have on the 17th of August, a session on football and soccer and the view of the game from both sides of the Atlantic. And then on the 31st of August, we have a webinar on challenging cancer, where two of our scholars will talk about cancer diagnostics and the differences between our healthcare systems on both sides of the Atlantic and how they tackle these things. So if you're interested in any of those, we encourage you to go to our website and check them out. We also have right now, one of our awards is open, and we have the rest of our UK awards opening in the next week. But right now, I'd really like to draw your attention to our Civic Science Storytelling Award, which is going to be up on the screen now. This is an incredible award. It's unique amongst our offerings. It's an 18-month opportunity for a early career science journalist to go to the University of Oregon, work with an incredible team there, and continue working on publications while they're there. It's an incredible grant. Really want you to spread that within your networks, apply for it if it's relevant to you. If not, please, anyone that you think it might be relevant to, we really want this opportunity to be known about far and wide, because it's such an incredible opportunity. So go and check that out on our website. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Lanta. A really great conversation. Really lovely to have you both here tonight. Thank you to Camilla as well, who's been running the show behind the scenes. And I hope everyone has a great week and a lovely evening.
Thanks. Bye.